March 7, 1945. A railway tunnel cut into a 600-foot cliff called the Erpler Lay on the east bank of the Rhine. The cliff sits directly across the water from a small town called Remagen, halfway between Bonn and Koblenz. Inside the tunnel, in the dark, a German major named Hans Scheller is trying to understand how he came to be responsible for the one thing in the entire Reich that was never supposed to happen. He had arrived that afternoon. He had been given command of the bridge roughly 2 hours before the Americans appeared on the heights above the town. He had perhaps 1,000 men, and most of them were not soldiers in any sense Scheller would have recognized 2 years earlier. 36 convalescents, a company of engineers, 180 boys of the Hitler Youth, 200 Luftwaffe anti-aircraft gunners with no aircraft left to shoot at, 500 civilians of the Volkssturm, old men and teenagers handed rifles and told to hold the western gate of Germany. At a little before 4 in the afternoon, the engineers fired the demolition charges. The Ludendorff Bridge lifted, shuttered, dropped, and stood. The main charge had not gone, and across the river, men of the United States 9th Armored Division were already running onto the planking, cutting wires as they came. That is the scene every documentary shows you. The intact bridge, the lucky charge that failed, the Americans pouring across the last great barrier into the heart of Germany. It is true, and it is the smallest part of the story. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The part nobody shows you is what happened in the days afterward, not on the bridge, but at desks, in headquarters tents, in a commandeered restaurant near a village called Bernbach, on the pages of a diary kept by a man in Berlin who wrote every single night without fail, because the German army did not only lose a bridge that week. The men who commanded that army sat down, in the way professional soldiers always have, and they recorded what they thought it meant, and what the most senior of them wrote, or refused to write, or shot themselves rather than live to write, is the real obituary of the Western Front. This is a story of what German commanders set down on paper in the weeks America crossed the Rhine. And read carefully, in the right order. It is a story of an army that had already finished arguing with itself about whether the war was lost. It was only arguing about who to shoot for it. Part 1. The river that was supposed to save them. To understand why a single bridge produced executions, you have to understand what the Rhine meant to the people running the war from Berlin. By the early spring of 1945, the Reich had almost nothing left except geography. The summer of 1944 had taken France. The Battle of the Bulge, the Great Ardennes Gamble of December, had spent the last assembled panzer reserves of the German army for a few weeks of winter alarm and then collapsed. In the east, the Red Army stood on the Oder. Budapest was gone. Breslau was surrounded. The cities were burning at night under the bombers. The army that had once driven to the gates of Moscow and the suburbs of Cairo was now a defensive force fighting on the soil of Germany itself. And in front of that army, on the western side, ran the Rhine. It is one of the great rivers of Europe, wide and fast and cold, and it served as the western moat of Germanic Europe since before the Romans. Adolf Hitler had built an entire final hope around it. The plan, if a wish can be called a plan, was that the Rhine would hold the Anglo-Americans long enough for something to change. New aircraft, a split between the Western Allies and Stalin, a miracle on the model of Frederick the Great, whose biography Hitler and his propaganda minister were both rereading that spring for comfort. The river would buy the time, and time would produce the miracle. So the order went out. Every bridge across the Rhine was to be destroyed before it could fall into Allied hands. Across the whole length of the river, the German engineers carried out that order. Roughly 50 bridges were blown. By early March, the Rhine was almost everywhere, exactly the barrier Hitler needed it to be. Almost everywhere. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had been built during the First World War. In 1916, named for the general who ran Germany's war effort then, designed to carry troops and supplies west of the fighting in France. It sat 40 miles behind the front, in a quiet sector nobody expected to matter. And it was still standing on the 7th of March because of a paperwork problem that the German command had created itself. The previous autumn, A bridge at Cologne had been destroyed by accident when an American bomb set off its pre-wired demolition charges in a chain reaction. Hitler had been enraged. He ordered that bridges were no longer to be wired in advance. The explosives were to be stored nearby, and the charges only fitted when the enemy came within about 8 kilometers, and the bridge was only to be blown on a written order. He threatened the engineers responsible for premature demolitions with court-martial. Read that sequence again, because it is the hinge of the entire story. The German command, terrified of losing a bridge too early, built a system that guaranteed they would lose one too late. The men at Remagen had been told that blowing the bridge without written authorization could cost them their lives. So when the Americans came faster than anyone believed possible, the men on the spot hesitated, sought authorization, used a smaller emergency charge instead of full load, and watched the span refuse to fall. Fear the court did exactly what the enemy could not. It saved the bridge. The first American across was a sergeant named Alexander Drobick. Within 24 hours, the 9th Armored Division had a bridgehead on the German side of the Rhine, the first hostile crossing of that river since Napoleon. And the news began traveling east up the chain of command toward the desks where it would be written down. Part 2. The night the telephone rang in Berlin. We do not have a candid private diary written by the German field commander at Remagen that night, and that absence is itself part of the answer to the question this story is asking. But we have something almost as revealing. We have the reaction at the top, recorded in detail, because the man at the top reacted the way he always did. He looked for someone to punish. Hitler was informed of the intact capture on the 8th of March. The accounts of that moment agree on the temperature of it. He was beside himself. The river that was supposed to save the Reich had been breached in a quiet sector by a spearhead of American tanks, and the bridge that should have dropped into the water was instead carrying Sherman tanks east toward the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart. His first instinct was not to ask how to seal the bridgehead. It was to ask who had failed. Within a day, he had ordered a special tribunal, a flying court-martial, to travel to the area and try the officers held responsible for the disaster. He placed it under a hard-line general named Rudolf Hübner. The court was made up of 3 Nazi officers. By the accounts that survive, not one of them was a trained lawyer. Several of the condemned would have no real defense at all. The court did its work in a commandeered restaurant. The men it tried had, almost all of them, been victims of the same impossible orders that lost a bridge. Major Hans Scheller, the officer rushed in 2 hours before the end with 8 men and a radio, was sentenced to death. So was a Major Herbert Strobel and a Major August Kraft, engineering officers tangled in the demolition failure, and a 4th officer with them. On the 14th of March, the day of sentencing, they were taken into the woods of the Westerwald and shot, in pairs, in 2 small villages. Their families lost their pension rights, restored only after the war by a Germany that no longer existed when the sentences were carried out. The 5th man, Captain Willy Bragg, who had actually commanded the bridge security, escaped the firing squad for the simplest reason. He had been captured by the Americans. He was sentenced to death in his absence, safe in a prison camp, while the men who had stood beside him were executed. There was a 6th case, and it is the one that tells you what the German command had become by March of 1945. A general major named Richard von Bothmer, who had held command in the Bonn and Remagen area, was prosecuted for surrendering Bonn without enough of a fight. He was stripped of his rank, reduced to private, and sentenced to 5 years. He was 48 years old. His wife was already dead. His son had been killed in the war. In the courtroom, after the sentence, he took a pistol belonging to a court official and shot himself where he stood. This is the answer, in its rawest form, to the question of what German commanders did in the days America crossed the Rhine. Some of them sat in a restaurant and signed death warrants for other German officers. One of them killed himself in front of the men who had just convicted him, and none of it put a single American back across the river. If this kind of forensic reconstruction is the version of the war you want kept alive, the version with the court-martial and the names and the failed charge rather than just a triumphant photograph, the like button genuinely helps this channel reach other people who want the same thing. It costs you a second. It keeps these men from disappearing. Part 3. The men who outrank the dead. Above the executed majors stood the field marshals, and their reaction to the Rhine is recorded in a different ledger, not death warrants. dismissals, and the private verdicts of men who already knew. When the bridge fell, the commander-in-chief in the West, the senior soldier on the entire front, was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He was 69 years old, the most senior officer in the German army, a Prussian of the old school who had commanded in Poland, in France, in Russia, and through the long retreat across France in 1944. He had been relieved before and recalled before. He was, by every account, a professional who had concluded long ago that the war could not be won and who continued to serve anyway. Rundstedt's recorded verdict on the situation in those weeks was not written in a flowery diary. It was spoken to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's military yes-man, and it was as blunt as a man in his position could afford to be. He told Keitel that Hitler should make peace, that the war was lost, and the only sane course was to end it, for that, in March of 1945, Rundstedt was relieved of the command for the third and final time. It was the only kind of diary entry a field marshal could make in that regime and survive. He said the unsayable to the one man who would carry it to Hitler, and he was removed for it rather than shot, because even Hitler could not quite bring himself to execute the most senior soldier in the army. Rundstedt would be captured by the American 36th Infantry Division in May, suffer a heart attack under interrogation, and spend his last useful months as a source for the British military historian Basil Adelhart, the same historian who would later edit Rommel's papers. His real testimony about the Rhine survives not as a diary, but as the reason he lost his job. The man Hitler brought in to replace him was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, pulled from Italy where he had conducted one of the most skillful defensive campaigns of the war. His soldiers called him Smiling Albert. He arrived in the West around the middle of March to take command of a front that no longer had a river in front of it, only a widening American bridgehead and the certainty of more crossings to come. Kesselring was an optimist by reputation and by temperament, the kind of commander Hitler liked precisely because he did not say the things Rundstedt said. And yet even Kesselring, in his later written account, described what he inherited in the plainest terms a professional can use. He had been handed a collapsing front, exhausted formations, no fuel, no air cover, and a chain of command in which the man in Berlin still insisted on personally approving the movement of battalions. He took the job and did what he could, which by then was the management of an ending that, if you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Below Rundstedt and Kesselring, commanding the Army group directly facing the breakthrough, was Field Marshal Walter Model. Remember that name. He is the one the rest of this story bends toward. Model was Hitler's favorite firefighter, the general sent to every crisis on every front, a man whose personal loyalty to Hitler had survived even the July plot of the previous summer. When the Remagen bridgehead opened, it was Model's responsibility to crush it. He was given a corps under General Fritz Bayerlein and ordered to seal the wound. And here the record catches Model in a small, revealing act of command. Bayerlein wanted to counterattack at once, on the 10th of March. Before the Americans could thicken their grip, Model overruled him. He insisted on waiting until infantry could relieve the armor for a coordinated, methodical assault. It was a textbook decision. It was a correct decision by the manual Model had spent 30 years mastering. And it was useless, because the thing pouring across the Ludendorff Bridge was not a problem the manual covered. Every hour Model waited for his tidy, coordinated attack. The Americans landed more men, more tanks, more guns than his entire army group could field. The methodical German way of war was being asked to fight an opponent who simply arrived faster than method allowed. Part 4. The Diary That Did Not Lie. There is one German diary from those weeks that survives complete, dated entry by dated entry, and it was kept by a man who was not a general at all. He was Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and his diary for the spring of 1945 is one of the strangest documents the war produced, because in it you can watch a true believer narrate the end of his own world in real time while refusing every single night to draw the obvious conclusion. Goebbels was not a field commander, but he sat at the center of the regime in the daily military briefings, closer to Hitler than almost anyone. What he wrote down each night is the closest thing we have to the private mind of the German High Command as the Rhine gave way. And it is worth reading slowly, because the value of it is in the gap between what he records and what he allows himself to understand. In early March, as the Americans reached the river, he wrote that the leadership had never really imagined events taking this course. That is an extraordinary admission from the regime's chief storyteller. The men running the war were genuinely surprised that their last barrier was being reached. Then, almost in the same breath, he talked himself back into hope. The Western democracies were about to crack from within. The U-boats would turn the Atlantic. New aircraft would clear the skies, hold fur at the front, and a way out would appear. On the 22nd of March, the day Patton's army was about to slip across the river in the south, Goebbels recorded that the military situation in both East and West had become extraordinarily critical, that in the space of a single day it had shifted noticeably against Germany. The next night, he allowed himself one of the most quietly devastating lines in the whole diary. He admitted that even his own work, his propaganda, his great gift, was no longer fully effective. The reports reaching him said German soldiers were surrendering rather than dying in place. The machine of belief he had spent 12 years building was failing in the field. And then, having written all that, he reached for his copy of Carlyle's Life of Frederick the Great. Frederick, too, he reminded himself, had doubted his star, and at the darkest hour a bright star had risen and Prussia had been saved. Why should the same miracle not save Germany now? He wrote it as comfort. He wrote it as a man who needed the past to promise a future the present was refusing to give him. By the end of March, after Patton and Montgomery had both crossed in force, the comfort ran out. Goebbels wrote, in one short sentence, that this was the beginning of catastrophe in the West. No Carlyle, no miracle, just the word catastrophe, set down by the one man whose entire career had been the denial of catastrophe. That is the diary the question in the title is really pointing at, not a general's tidy field journal, because the generals were too busy being relieved, executed, or overruled to keep one. The honest German record of the Rhine crossings is a diary of a propagandist who could no longer make himself believe his own product, writing the word catastrophe in the dark while a man beside him reread a 200-year-old biography for hope. If your father or grandfather crossed the Rhine in the spring of 1945, with the 9th Armored at Remagen, with Patton's 3rd Army at Oppenheim, with the airborne at Wesel, or as one of the engineers who bolted the pontoon bridges together under fire, I would be honored to read about him in the comments. The unit, the name, anything you remember. The official histories recorded the field marshals. They almost never recorded the man who paddled an assault boat across a freezing river at 2 a.m. You may be the only person left who can put his name on the record. Part 5, Oppenheim, Wesel, and the verdict no one signed. While the court-martial was still drying its ink, the second blow landed, and it landed in a way that exposed the German command's whole predicament more cleanly than Remagen had. On the night of the 22nd of March, far to the south near a town called Oppenheim, General George Patton's 3rd Army crossed the Rhine. There was no artillery barrage, no aerial bombardment, no airborne drop, no smoke screen. Patton put roughly 500 assault boats into Blackwater and simply went, trusting speed and silence over weight of fire. The crossing was so quiet, so unexpected, that the first Germans the Americans met on the far bank surrendered out of sheer confusion, apparently unaware that an entire army was coming over the river behind them. The assault cost the 3rd Army something on the order of 20 to 30 men. In the days that followed, it scooped up around 19,000 prisoners, many of them old men and boys with no will left to fight. Patton telephoned his superior, Omar Bradley, and told him, in effect, not to announce it yet. He was across the Rhine, and the Germans did not even know it. There were so few of them in the sector that the news could wait. That is the German army at the moment of the crossing, seen from the other side of the river, not a wall of fanatical defenders, a scatter of exhausted men and frightened civilians. So thin on the ground, an entire American field army crossed Germany's great river in the dark and barely woke them. The next night, the 23rd, the contrast became total. Far to the north, near Wesel, Field Marshal Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, the crossing the Allies had been planning for months. Where Patton had used silence, Montgomery used everything. A storm of artillery, waves of bombers. 2 full airborne divisions dropped across the river in daylight the following morning. It was a set-piece battle the British had spent half a year preparing. The operation meant to erase the memory of the failed airborne gamble at Arnhem the previous autumn. The Germans facing it could do almost nothing. The Luftwaffe was effectively gone, starved of fuel and pilots. The defending formations were the worn-down remnants of armies that had been retreating and dying since Normandy. The two crossings, Patton's silent dash and Montgomery's thunderous assault, were opposite in every way except the one that mattered. Both succeeded, and the German army could not seriously contest either. Back in the Allied camp, Bradley made a point of announcing that the Third Army had crossed the Rhine without bombing, without airborne troops, without even artillery preparation. It was a deliberate jab at Montgomery and his elaborate methods, a piece of inter-Allied rivalry being conducted across the corps of the German river line. The Allies could afford to argue about style. The Germans could only argue about who to blame. And the Remagen Bridge itself wrote the final line of its own story. For 10 days the Germans threw everything they had left at it. Artillery, frogmen swimming down the river with explosives, a giant 600-millimeter siege mortar, and, in their first use against a single tactical target, V-2 rockets, the most advanced weapons on Earth, fired at one railway bridge. None of it worked in time. The Americans had already built their own bridges alongside it and poured 6 divisions across. Then, on the 17th of March, weakened by all the punishment and the strain of traffic, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on its own, killing around 28 American engineers who were working to shore it up. By then it no longer mattered. The bridgehead was permanent. The river was lost. Part 6. The Field Marshal Who Left No Diary. So we come back to Walter Model, because his is the entry that finishes the story, and he never wrote it down. He performed it. After the Rhine crossings, Model's army group B was driven back into the industrial sprawl of the Ruhr. By the 1st of April, the two American thrusts, Bradley's forces from the Remagen breakout in the south and the northern crossing forces, met behind him and closed a ring. Inside that ring sat the better part of an army group, around 300,000 men, the largest German force to be encircled in the West in the entire war. Model had spent his career as the master of exactly this kind of nightmare. He was the man Hitler sent when a front was caving in, the specialist in holding the unholdable. But there was nothing to hold now. By the middle of April, he understood it completely. He dissolved Army Group B as a formal command. He discharged the youngest and the oldest of his soldiers and told the militia and the non-combatants to take off their uniforms and go home. He was, in his own grim way, releasing them from a war that was already over, sparing them a pointless last stand. For himself, there was the oath. Model had reaffirmed his loyalty to Hitler more fervently than almost any other field marshal, had purged suspected plotters from his own staff after July of 1944, had built his identity on being the Führer's most reliable soldier. And a field marshal of that Germany, in his understanding of it, did not surrender. The propaganda of the regime had spent 2 years branding Field Marshal Paul as a coward for surrendering at Stalingrad rather than dying. Model had absorbed that lesson down to the bone. On the 21st of April, 1945, in a wood near Duisburg, with his army dissolved around him and the Americans everywhere, Walter Model walked into the trees and shot himself. He was unwilling, the records say, to surrender his rank into captivity. He left no memoir, no apologia, no edited papers smuggled out by a widow. He left a dissolved command and a body in the forest. That was his diary entry on the loss of the Rhine and everything beyond it. 9 days later, Hitler shot himself in Berlin. Within a week, the war in Europe was over. So, what did German commanders write in their diaries the night America crossed the Rhine? The honest answer is layered, and it is more damning than any single dramatic quotation could be. At the bottom, the junior officers wrote nothing, because they were shot by their own side for a bridge that fell into American hands through orders their own leader had issued. In the middle, the field marshals wrote no candid journals, because the one who spoke the truth out loud, Rundstedt, was fired for it, and the one who replaced him, Kesselring, could only manage to collapse and explain it carefully years later in a memoir. The favorite, Model, refused to write anything at all and put a bullet in his own head rather than be captured. And at the political summit, the only man still keeping a complete nightly diary was Goebbels, who recorded the surprise, then the criticality, then the failure of his own propaganda, then the single word catastrophe, all the while reaching for a dead Prussian king to promise him a miracle that was never going to come. Put those records side by side, and they say the same thing in 4 different voices. The German army that met the Americans at the Rhine in March of 1945 was not beaten by one lucky bridge. It was beaten by a system that had run out of everything except the habit of obedience. No fuel for the planes, no reserves for the counterattack, no river left to hide behind, and a command structure so frightened the man at the top that it executed its own officers, relieved its own best general for honesty, and waited for a coordinated attack that the enemy's sheer speed made impossible. The Americans crossed at Remagen because German engineers were too afraid of a court-martial to blow a bridge on time. They crossed at Oppenheim because there was almost nobody left on the far bank to stop them. They crossed at Wesel because the German Air Force no longer existed. Every one of those facts is a verdict, and the German commanders who lived through it knew it. Some of them wrote it down. Some of them said it out loud and lost their jobs. One of them refused to write it and walked into the woods instead. The most respected defensive commanders in the world, men whose names filled the staff colleges, were asked to hold a river with an army that moved when Berlin allowed it and an air force that no longer flew, against an enemy that crossed in silence one night and in thunder the next and could afford to do either. There was, as Rundstedt told Keitel before they fired him, only one rational thing left to write: make peace. It was the truest diary entry any of them produced, and it ended his career. If this walk through the diaries and the death warrants and the dissolved commands gave you something the triumphant version never does, the like button keeps the channel visible to people who want the history straight rather than comfortable. And subscribe if you want the next one, because there are other figures in this collapse whose private records say things very different from the speeches that were made about them at the time. And remember at the end of it what the records themselves keep insisting. This was decided by fuel in factories and the speed of trucks and the absence of an air force. But it was lived by men with names. Hans Scheller, shot in the wood for a bridge he commanded for 2 hours. Richard von Bothmer, dead by his own hand in a courtroom. The 28 American engineers who went down with the bridge they were trying to save. Walter Model, alone in the trees near Duisburg. They were not numbers in a report. They had names. And at 80 years' distance, they have earned the right to keep them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Rundstedt was fired for it, and the one who replaced him, Kesselring, could only manage the collapse and explain it carefully years later in a memoir. The favorite, Model, refused to write anything at all and put a bullet in his own head rather than be captured. And at the political summit, the only man still keeping a complete nightly diary was Goebbels, who recorded the surprise, then the criticality, then the failure of his own propaganda, then the single word catastrophe, all the while reaching for a dead Prussian king to promise him a miracle that was never going to come. Put those records side by side, and they say the same thing in 4 different voices. The German army that met the Americans at the Rhine in March of 1945 was not beaten by one lucky bridge. It was beaten by a system that had run out of everything except the habit of obedience. No fuel for the planes, no reserves for the counterattack, no river left to hide behind, and a command structure so frightened the man at the top that it executed its own officers, relieved its own best general for honesty, and waited for a coordinated attack that the enemy's sheer speed made impossible. The Americans crossed at Remagen because German engineers were too afraid of a court-martial to blow a bridge on time. They crossed at Oppenheim because there was almost nobody left on the far bank to stop them. They crossed at Wesel because the German Air Force no longer existed. Every one of those facts is a verdict, and the German commanders who lived through it knew it. Some of them wrote it down. Some of them said it out loud and lost their jobs. One of them refused to write it and walked into the woods instead. The most respected defensive commanders in the world, men whose names filled the staff colleges, were asked to hold a river with an army that moved when Berlin allowed it and an air force that no longer flew, against an enemy that crossed in silence one night and in thunder the next and could afford to do either. There was, as Rundstedt told Keitel before they fired him, only one rational thing left to write: make peace. It was a truest diary entry any of them produced, and it ended his career. If this walk through the diaries and the death warrants and the dissolved commands gave you something the triumphant version never does, the like button keeps the channel visible to people who want the history straight rather than comfortable. And subscribe if you want the next one, because there are other figures in this collapse whose private records say things very different from the speeches that were made about them at the time. And remember, at the end of it, what the records themselves keep insisting. This was decided by fuel in factories and the speed of trucks and the absence of an air force. But it was lived by men with names. Hans Scheller, shot in the wood for a bridge he commanded for 2 hours. Richard von Bothmer, dead by his own hand in a courtroom. The 28 American engineers who went down with the bridge they were trying to save. Walter Model, alone in the trees near Duisburg. They were not numbers in a report. They had names. And at 80 years' distance, they have earned the right to keep them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.